Hello, Birmingham. Are you with us?
Yes, I am.
So, how are we feeling given the current climate of the election so far? Any personal thoughts of your own?
Well, I'm a little bit biased, obviously, because I'm an American citizen. I'm from Texas. So I'm kind of anxiously awaiting what tonight looks like. We all kind of are here. We have plans to continue to watch until hopefully some results come in later tonight as well after our broadcast is over.
So, being in Birmingham, we've also learned recently that Birmingham is going into lockdown along with the rest of England. How are you feeling about this as a university?
As a university, our university is taking a lot of precautions for its students, giving students the option to study fully online if they're not comfortable being in person, but still giving them the option for in-person classes if they feel comfortable going to campus. With universities remaining open, we are happy that that's an option, and a lot of our professors here on campus are excited to continue to teach in person as well.
That's very good. And what seems to be the students' perspectives on the coronavirus? Are they sort of not, well, quite obviously, probably not looking forward to go back into another lockdown, seeming as there's a lot of freshers, well, say freshers period is quite gone now, who have only just sort of resettled back into a regular schedule. Do you think this will affect them?
I think to some extent we all have to understand that the university experience this term, potentially this year, is not going to be what everybody's used to. Unfortunately, with coronavirus, we have to consider the safety of everybody in the community and the country over necessarily our own personal wishes. And I feel like a lot of students are really understanding of that. Granted, there have been quite a few students that have gone home for this lockdown period as well.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. Well, I'll hand over the proverbial baton to Birmingham. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Scher. The University of Birmingham team, made up of myself and 5 other current and former students who will be introducing themselves later tonight, will be discussing reshaping NATO and transatlantic relations during our segment. Expanding on this, the University of Birmingham will be exploring Trump's foreign policy, the special relationship between the United States of America and the United Kingdom, United States military strategy, and the implications of the election on NATO, European defense, and the United States foreign policy in the Middle East and Africa. This great team of students, plus student debaters from the university and outside experts, seek to give an academic perspective on this topic, as well as give insight on what the results of tonight's election will mean for these avenues of foreign policy.
This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO.
What America is officially calling a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russian troops spreading out.
Россия самостоятельный, активный участник международной жизни. У нее, как и у других стран, есть национальные интересы, которые нужно учитывать и уважать.
وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه.
تكبير الله أكبر تكبير الله أكبر. stormed the hall, shooting in the air, claiming their actions were revenge for France's intervention in Syria.
PLA will perform its missions more effectively in a new historical period.
Thousands more have arrived on these beaches in the last few weeks, and they're now part of an elaborate smuggling system.
NATO is obsolete, it's old, it's fat, it's sloppy.
Macron's calling for a new European army.
I think if we increase our budget is to have to build our autonomy and to become an actual sovereign.
What? Are you kidding me?
The only two countries that can actually play a leadership role in Europe are Germany and France.
Finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations.
Krieg gibt. Und das ist ja keine Armee gegen die NATO.
Angela Merkel, although being a strong leader, is in the process of leaving at the end of her own last term for what she said. And Emmanuel Macron, because of the difficulties that he's experiencing at home in coping with COVID-19, and then again with new terroristic attacks.
If you describe our operation as an invasion again, we'll take the easy road. We'll open the doors and send you 3.6 million refugees.
What threatens Europe today is neither a particular state nor a particular nation. It's the policy of a certain state which results in permanent violation of international law.
We're paying too much. We're spending a tremendous billions and billions of dollars on NATO.
That Trump has engaged in a fashion which is fairly unusual, I think it would be fair to say, in terms of the way presidents ought to conduct themselves in office.
Obviously have to add different nations in, because you have nations that aren't in NATO that are very much into the world of terror.
So if in the second Trump term he continues to do those things, then maybe in the long run it would have been a rough ride, yes, for NATO.
A tremendous amount of captured fighters, ISIS fighters, over in Syria. And they're all under lock and key, but many are from France, many are from Germany, many are from UK. They're mostly from Europe.
For his personality, for the erratic policy that he makes, one day one position, the other day another.
Would you like some nice ISIS fighters? Yeah, I can give them to you. You can take every one you want.
You know who I am. You know who he is. You know his character. You know my character.
And keep America out of endless and costly foreign wars.
Erratic, crazy president who knows not a damn thing about foreign policy.
Just as radical left. Will you shut up, man? Listen, who is on your...
And thank you to Marquetta, our studio producer, for that wonderful video. With that, we switch over to Adam for our first debate.
Hey there, my name's Adam McKinnon, and welcome to this segment. We'll be taking a broad look at Trump's foreign policy with our first interview with Brian Bennett, the senior White House correspondent for Time magazine, and then breaking that down in a student debate. Following on from that, we'll be chatting to Scott Lucas, who's a professor at the University of Birmingham, asking, is the special relationship dead? And then breaking that down as well. But first, we jump into the first video interview with Brian Bennett. I'd like to welcome Brian Bennett, senior White House correspondent for Time magazine and one of the rare reporters who's managed to evoke a more reasonable response from the president, who in response to one of Brian's questions commented, "Nasty question, but it deserves to be asked, I guessed." Brian, I blatantly stole your Twitter bio there, but thanks for taking the time to call me amidst your crazy workload in this wild, wild election.
Yeah, happy to be here, Adam.
Great, let's jump into it. So there's some that argue that while Trump's approach to foreign policy is unpolished and unconventional, it's part of his wider role as a disruptor and is exactly what America needs. To what extent has Trump's America First strategy brought success abroad and also at home?
Well, in a lot of ways, Trump has done exactly what he campaigned on. He has asked tough questions about American foreign policy, wanted to rethink a lot of the postures that America has taken over the years, including U.S. signing on to international trading agreements and rethink what the terms were of those. U.S. posture towards Russia, for example, he wanted to rethink the U.S. posture in the Middle East and towards Israel and on the Palestine question. In Iraq and Afghanistan, he thought, look, we need to rethink this. What's happening is not working. Now, what Trump brings to that, one, an unpredictable and improvisational style, a lack of rigor in thinking about like next, third, fourth, fifth order implications of decisions. So it's been very destabilizing in a lot of ways to have that foreign policy play out.
Well, do you think there's potentially going to be a step away from impulse-driven foreign policy decisions? In your article about the most recent presidential debate, you noted how Trump pivoted away from crazy uncle, letting Biden speak, sticking to his core anti-establishment message, and even complimenting the moderator. I'd say you know Trump's character pretty well, or as well as you can know it. Is this a reformed Trump? If Trump wins, are we likely to see a more stable, statesman-like leader and a more stable world? Him forming alliances rather than leaving them, signing treaties rather than ripping them up. What would the next 4 years look like under this new statesman-like idea of Trump?
No, the next 4 years are going to be more of the same. I mean, Trump is even campaigning on his pitch for the next 4 years, if he gets reelected, would be more of Trump and the Trump style. So no, the second debate is not an indication of Trump trying to act more presidential or be more rational. It's instead a reflection of how devastating the first debate performance, where he was on attack and interrupting, how devastating that was to his poll numbers. And he and his advisors realized that he needed to have a performance that was more traditional, more in keeping with how previous presidential debates had gone.
With Biden, would we see someone who makes more calculated decisions and thinks kind of 4 or 5 moves ahead, a game of chess rather than checkers, do you think?
So Biden would represent a return to more of a traditional American approach to national foreign policy. So a return to embracing NATO, to looking at trade agreements, looking at climate accords, he'll want to return to bringing the U.S. back to the center of international agreements. So it would be a major shift in foreign policy if Biden gets reelected. I mean, I do think that there are real problems that Trump has pointed out with American foreign policy that predated him. You know, our seemingly endless wars in Afghanistan, in the Middle East. Like, we need to rethink that. We need to come up with smart ways to use our military might and our troops and the lives of our soldiers. So that's important to ask those questions, those hard questions. And also the Middle East. I mean, we need to look at the Middle East and make rational, informed decisions that that help lead to stability and also good democratic values in the Middle East. So those are things that I think are going to be grappled with by the next administration. And I suspect if Biden gets elected, we're going to see a more traditional approach to those questions.
Brilliant. Well, Brian, thank you for a very insightful interview, and thank you for your time again.
Yeah, good to see you.
So let's jump straight into it. Robbie, it's blatantly clear that Trump doesn't think ahead. His reckless Twitter diplomacy has led to a more volatile world. Where's the benefit in this disruptor approach?
So what Trump has done really well is that he's been strong on China and Russia. He's put economic sanctions on both these countries. He's withdrawn from treaties when they violated the terms of these contracts. Whereas previously, if you look in the post-Cold War era, that simply wasn't the case. U.S. administrations wanted to ally with them. They invited them into Western markets, and they traded. And it's because of that Russia and China are now the cyber, nuclear, and economic superpowers we know them to be today. So the U.S. wants to compete. They really need to be tough on them.
Great. Thank you, Robbie. So, Laura, looking at the last 4 years of foreign policy, we've seen historic meetings with Kim Jong-un, unprecedented peace deals, and China put in their place, like Robbie just mentioned. This sounds like success to me.
I wouldn't say it's success. It's a lot more a case of optics. He had dialogue with Kim Jong-il, and then they have achieved nothing. There's been no stoppage of nuclear weapons. China is one of the few economies at the moment that's still growing, and he has not acknowledged the risk of Russia, despite information coming out that they were putting bounties on soldiers' heads in Afghanistan. He's not acknowledging any of the risks that are sort of facing America today. He's just obsessed with China.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laura. So give me your quick pitches. Robbie, another 4 years of Trump's foreign policy. Why would Biden's be worse?
Because a lot of his campaign so far is focused on domestic policy. So, for instance, universal healthcare, universal education, a $2 trillion climate plan. If you think logistically, how is he going to be able to balance that with funding for NATO and competing with Russia and China? To me, he's focused on domestic policy will mean his foreign policy will take the back seat and will be neglected.
Great. Thank you, Robbie. And Laura, your quick pitch, same thing. Why would the world be a better place under Biden than Trump?
Biden is a known quantity. Other, obviously, countries know what they are getting. They don't know what they're getting with Trump. And Biden's made it clear that he will return to the world stage and bring America with it. We need stability, and we're not getting that with Trump. He's dividing not only his country, but the world. And that's why we need someone who represents stability more than anything.
Well, thank you, Robbie and Laura, for your pitches and your insightful answers. We're now going to jump into the next video interview with Scott Lucas.
Scott, we're about to leave the biggest trading bloc in the world. We seem to fall in and out of favour with the president at an incredibly volatile rate. We've only just reversed a decision to allow Huawei to build the UK's 5G network, which would have potentially undermined US security interests. So let me ask you, is the special relationship dead?
Special relationship never existed. In fact, that's the problem. I mean, it's a myth. It's a powerful myth because, your folks and my folks from the States fought together in World War II, that the US and UK worked on that framework that underpins so much of international relations, the economic institutions, political institutions, military institutions. But special? No. I mean, it's a convergence of interest. Now, it's a convergence of interest that politicians could work with. So, for example, everybody likes to refer to Churchill's speech in '46 about the Anglo-Saxon powers that would take on the Iron Curtain, for example. Harold Macmillan talking about we give you the brains to American brawn. The whole, whether it's Kennedy and Macmillan, or whether it's Reagan and Thatcher, or whether it's Blair with both Big Bush and then Bill Clinton, we have that idea of, oh yeah, we have this privileged position. But that's never been the case. I mean, there have been cases when, well before 2020, the United States has acted against British governments quite firmly. The Suez Canal crisis in 1956, when the Eisenhower administration almost threatened to bankrupt the UK if it did not cease fire with this half-assed, ridiculous plan to overthrow the Egyptian government.
What about NATO, Scott? That's an institution where the US and the UK are tied quite strongly together. I know the US, particularly Trump, has criticised NATO strongly for European allies not paying their fair share, but UK's has always been above the 2% budget requirement. Surely that's attractive to US to have a Western partner, particularly in this instability, in the rise of China and in these rising powers in the East, to have a Western power who shares some of its values, a strong military power that the US knows will have its back?
Certainly, I mean, the bedrock of this relationship, whether or not you want to call it special, the bedrock of it has been, we say we have shared values. Okay, fair enough, but it's actually in institutions. And when you have military institutions through NATO, yeah, that was very important because that gives you the framework for how those mutual interests can be implemented, whether you're talking about vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in Europe through the Cold War, whether you're talking about perspectives that the countries have had possibly on, let's say, an area like the Middle East or let's say Asia, or for example, after 9/11, when you're having to reconfigure your military approach because what has happened there with transnational threats.
Why is Biden better placed as the stabilizer and as the bipartisan moderator in international relations rather than Trump as the disruptor, recklessly chasing after American interests? Why do you think Biden is better placed to deal with those challenges rather than Trump?
Well, Biden administration is better placed than a Trump administration because it observes the rules of the game. With Trump, you have no clue if troops are staying, if they're going. You have no clue if the Americans are negotiating, the breaking off negotiations. Because at the end of the day, when the rules of international relations for one man is, I want to get the optimal photo opportunity that makes me look good, that is a long way from, if not necessarily like a win-win situation, it's a long way from the idea of how we maintain some idea of order. We could go country versus country across the world. We could talk about North Korea in that way. We can talk about Iran in that way. But here's the starting point. If you just simply rip up agreements, if you rip up accords, which is what's happened with the Iran nuclear deal, which is what's happened with China, if you rip everything up, taking action does not lead to progress. It just leads to further disorder.
There it is. Brilliant.
And there it is.
So I'm grateful to have Lloyd and Daniel with me to break down this interview on the special relationship. So starting with Lloyd, a lot on the left like to pile on Trump. And yes, while he's certainly an imperfect statesman, the US is still our most important ally. Shouldn't we be aiming to improve relations with America, particularly post-Brexit?
Look, of course, post-Brexit, we need to have a strong trading relationship with the US. But I think it's really worrying if we look to go too deep politically with the US. I mean, we've gained so much sovereignty when we leave the EU. It would be really dangerous to then give that away straight away to somewhere like the United States, where the political discourse is really rather different to what we consider acceptable in the UK. My main concern really would be on healthcare, where they perhaps look to their vision of healthcare and private, particularly. And so I think that those kind of things in political discourse and also socially with things like abortion, things that we consider very much untouchable political subjects, I think could end up becoming something that becomes mainstream. And I think that's very worrying for the UK.
Thank you, Lloyd. So Daniel, the special relationship is dead. It's always been a convergence of interests. Have interests under Trump now drifted? Should we be shopping around for other allies?
I would actually go one step further than Scott and say that it hasn't even existed even during the Second World War. So you only have to look at what Pat Buchanan said. He said that Britain was in her darkest hour. Roosevelt shook her down for every dime that they had. Similarly, during 1940, the agreement between Britain and the US in exchange for West Indian colonies, the Britain asked for 50 destroyers. In its darkest moment, the US only supplied 9 crummy tin can ships. So I think it has never existed, and I don't think it ever will exist. And I think in the future, I don't think that relationship is ever going to improve. I mean, I think Britain will be a declining power. And I think the US will look to Europe to increase its presence there.
Thank you, Daniel. So, guys, can you give me your quick pitches? Lloyd, from a completely selfish UK perspective, you get to pick the next president. Why is Biden better for Britain?
I think that if there's ever been a special relationship between the UK and the US, especially recently, it's been in international organisations. And we need someone like Biden to back the UK's Green Initiative to be able to actually become a world leader and to produce green energy and green products. And I think that someone like Trump, who consistently withdraws from international treaties, especially on the climate, I think we need someone like Biden who will engage with the climate issue in a much better way, and that will work for the UK.
Thank you, Lloyd. Daniel, same thing. Give me your quick pitch from a completely selfish UK perspective. Why is Trump better for Britain than Biden?
I actually disagree with Lloyd there. I think that Biden will operate his foreign policy in terms of strategy. I think he'll look to Europe for that. I think that Trump will be the best opportunity for the UK. He operates his foreign policy in terms of impulse. I think he's already expressed that he's willing to negotiate and express open relations with Boris Johnson. He's already referred to him as the Johnson of the UK. So I think there's definitely a relationship to be built there.
Thank you, Daniel. Lloyd and Daniel, thank you so much for being with me. And thanks to Brian Bennett, thanks to Robbie and Laura and Scott Lucas and you guys for spending this time. At the end of our segment now, I'm going to pass on to Frederick, who will be taking a deeper, more detailed look at NATO, its role in the world currently, and also a deeper look at European defence and what a potential Biden-Trump presidency would mean for European defence in the next 4 years and the next decade. Frederick.
So hello and welcome. My name is Frederick Rist, and on my segment, we will be focusing on U.S. military and grand strategy and how NATO fits into this. We will also be looking at some of the implications of the election outcome on the role of NATO in future U.S. defense policy. And with me from the U.S. Army War College, I have Professor John Denny. Welcome, Professor Denny, and thanks for joining.
My pleasure, Frederick. Thank you.
Yes, so let's just jump straight into it. I'll start out with some budgetary considerations. The fiscal year 2021 defense budget will allocate around $4.5 billion for the European Deterrence Initiative, meaning a 25% reduction in expenditure on European defense. What do you think this indicates about the role of NATO in U.S. global strategy?
Well, I think on its face, it doesn't look like the U.S. is putting as much of a priority on Europe relative to previous years. We need to remember, though, that the Congress gets a vote in this as well. In fact, 2 years ago, when the executive branch tried to cut the budget for the European Deterrence Initiative, or what we call EDI, Congress stepped in and increased that budget. And many of us here think that that's vital. That budget, EDI, pays for exercises, some of them quite large. It pays for infrastructure improvements in Europe that American forces and allied forces would use. And it also pays for these rotational deployments that have become a really important part of our deterrence and assurance mission. So, a step back in the funding is probably not a good thing from a strategic perspective. But again, Congress will get we'll get a say in this. To put this, though, in election context, we need to also remember that, the EDI has come under threat by efforts on the part of the Trump administration to raid it as a source of funding for the border wall in Mexico. And so I'm not sure if the reduction reflects that there's no longer a need for what's happening in Europe. I think that's incorrect. I think we still have investment needs there. Clearly, we need to maintain those rotational deployments. And this probably sends the wrong signal to our adversaries as well.
Right. Okay. So on that note, I want to continue. The U.S. is increasingly relying on rotational deployments as opposed to permanent stationing of forces in Europe. Does this indicate that the U.S. is becoming more of an offshore balancer? And how are Europeans reacting to this?
Well, I think we need to remember that the U.S. is not becoming an offshore balancer, as evidenced by the tens of thousands of U.S. troops that still remain in Europe today. Add to that the thousands more that rotate over from the United States on a continuous, or what we call heel-to-toe basis. That is, as soon as one leaves, another unit shows up, and thousands of troops are doing this every year. So I think the U.S. still has a very robust presence in Europe. It could be perhaps more robust in places like the Baltic states. But, the decision, or the announcement really, made by the Trump administration earlier this year in the summertime to further cut the American troop presence in Germany is probably, again, not the kind of signal we want to be sending to our adversaries. It undermines our ability to maintain deterrence and assurance in Europe. And so I think that's probably a step in the wrong direction. It appears as though the administration, though, is bent on pursuing this. Planning is underway, as I understand it, within the Pentagon. I think if Donald Trump is reelected, we should expect to see that reduction come to fruition over the next couple of years. None of these moves, when it comes to forward-based troops, occur overnight. It takes a lot of time. If Joe Biden is elected, I think we should expect to see that decision reversed pretty quickly. I don't know if we'll see a move away from these rotational deployments. My own sense, frankly, is that they're not quite as effective as permanent or forward stationing. They're certainly more expensive than permanent or forward stationing. I know that's a bit counterintuitive, but it costs us more to rotate troops every 9 months with their equipment. And they don't reassure as effectively with our allies, nor do I think they deter as effectively the adversary, in this case, Russia.
Right. So in terms of, you mentioned some activities in the Pentagon, and I want to pose you a question on that point. The Pentagon is currently developing a new warfighting concept, as well as new operational concepts for all of the services in view of the renewed focus on great power competition. How does NATO fit into all of this, and are the NATO members coordinating their policies in this point?
Yeah, Frederick, that's a good question. I think you're speaking of what we call multi-domain operations, or MDO. What we mean by that is multiple domains. We think of in a warfighting context or a conflict context, domains are like the land domain or the sea domain or the air domain. Lately, the cyber domain has gotten a lot more attention. And now space has been added, for NATO at least, as a domain of operations. Typically, in the past, we would think of a land force as operating and having effects in combat on the land, right? Armies tend to operate on land, and so most of their effects are land-based. Under the multi-domain operational concept or doctrine, though, what we expect to see, or what we are now asking our military forces of, is to have effects not only in their domain, but in other domains as well, creating multiple problems and challenges of all sorts for our adversaries to try to manage. And it's believed by many in the West now, certainly in my country, in the US, that this is what's necessary to engage in peer competition against near-peer rivals like Russia and China. You know, historically, we can compare this to another major dominant doctrine was air-land battle, right? In an air-land battle, most exemplified by the First Persian Gulf War, you know, you send in your combat jets first, they take out the enemy's jets, they suppress air defense, maybe they take out some ground targets. Then after a period of that going on for a few weeks, then you send in the ground forces, okay? And they take out other ground forces on the part of the enemy. That's it's very sequenced operation. It has an order to it. It's very kinetically focused. Multi-domain operations is out of sequence, doesn't appear to be orderly, involves kinetic and non-kinetic activities. And so this is the sort of the future, if you will, of American defense operations and doctrine. Now, where does NATO fit in? Well, Americans on both sides of the political aisle continue to think that we need to be operating in combat or in other contexts with our allies by our side. There's broad consensus on that. And so it's going to be vital to bring NATO along, vital for the U.S. to do this in order to fulfill our own strategy and protect our own interests. Now, I think you'll see NATO countries begin to do that. It's going to be a slow process. We in the States are sort of just rolling this out now, this operational concept. And so I think gradually you'll see the NATO allies kind of pulling along as well, heading in the same direction, especially and beginning with the larger allies. The UK, Germany, France, we'll expect them to sort of follow suit first.
Okay, so let's move on to some of the possible implications of the U.S. election outcome. How do you see a potential Biden administration tackling the 2% spending question on NATO allies?
You know, the 2% issue has sort of been a fixation for the Trump administration, and for better or worse, right? I think that if the Trump administration is reelected, we should expect to continue to see that fixation, and in fact, perhaps even become the grounds for a move to either get out of NATO or dramatically reduce the American commitment to the alliance. I think if Joe Biden is elected president, we'll see almost the opposite. This is one of those areas of policy where the two candidates have very different approaches. Joe Biden, judging at least by his past history and his voting record, has been a committed transatlanticist. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to give up on 2%, right? The 2% goal is a political agreement that all countries in NATO have subscribed to, committed themselves to. And both Democratic and Republican presidents of my country have pressed allies to maintain their commitment to that spending level. I would expect to see Biden continue that effort to get Europeans to increase their defense spending in the name of more equitable burden sharing. But I would not expect to see Biden use the 2% issue as a threat against NATO allies in the way that the Trump administration has, to either not defend those allies that don't spend the equivalent of 2% of their GDP on defense, or, as I mentioned, to use the 2% issue as a justification for withdrawing from the alliance. Now, I think, as I said, we should still expect to see burden sharing be an issue in the transatlantic debate between the U.S. and its NATO allies. Even though burden sharing has improved dramatically over the last 5 years, frankly, we can thank Vladimir Putin for that. His invasion of Ukraine was really what set that off. And it's also the result of ISIS's rise and the threat of returning foreign fighters. But that threat environment is really what changed things for Europeans. Now, we're still not quite where we need to be in burden sharing. And so I think you should expect to see a Biden administration, if there is one, continue to press these issues to pursue greater, more equitable burden sharing with the allies, but probably not as vociferously in a way that undermines deterrence, that frankly scares our allies in the way that maybe the Trump administration has.
Right. Okay. So just a final quick question. As U.S. defense policy is increasingly orientated towards great power competition with China, should NATO as a whole follow this direction? And how should it balance, deterrence against Russia?
Frederick, the alliance is wrestling with this question right now. I mean, obviously, Russia remains the most acute threat confronting the alliance, and it will probably be so for some time. Yet, Russia is also declining power. So in the short run, I think that the alliance needs to remain focused on Russia. And by that, I mean probably over the next 5 to 10 years. But frankly, we and Europeans face a large and growing threat from China. It is frankly, a malign actor, anti-democratic, bent on using its economy to bend the will of individual countries and the global system to its own ends. That's going to have implications for Europe, and it already has to some degree, in terms of defense technology, in terms of infrastructure that matters to the military in Europe, and in terms of Chinese leverage over broader security questions or issues facing the transatlantic community. And we have to worry about that community being splintered by China's efforts. NATO is now turning to this, as evidenced by its efforts to study this challenge. And I think it makes sense that the U.S. look to its allies to join it in addressing that challenge.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Denny. That was very insightful, and thank you for having you on.
Frederick, my pleasure. Thank you.
So now moving on, I will be joined by a panel of student debaters, including Robbie, Laura, and Stefan. Right, so I'll just, building on what Professor Denny has just spoken of, I want to ask you, what is your opinion on the priorities of NATO? Should the alliance focus more on competing with China, or should it retain its traditional focus on deterring Russia? Let's start out with you, Robbie.
So as a part of the NATO 2030 campaign, China is actually sort of recognized as the main threat to NATO. However, a lot of European economies are actually relying on China's economic aid. So really, the main threat, the main focus for NATO should be Russia. And this is partly because the Russian threat is more feasible. So of all the countries combined in NATO, they have a greater military spending and size already than Russia. But the threat is more immediate. When Trump withdrew from the INF Treaty in 2017, this exposed the whole of Europe to Russian nuclear weaponry. And in a way, Russia's already dealing with NATO's already dealing with the Russian problem. You have the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states, which protects them against Russian aggression. What they need to focus a bit more on with the Russian threat is cybersecurity. Lithuania and Finland are kind of dealing with this kind of on their own, but they need to be kind of a joint NATO initiative, I think. So I think for the feasibility and the immediacy of the Russian problem, NATO should focus on this rather than China.
Right, and then let's move on to you, Laura. What is your opinion on this?
I would echo what Robbie just said, where the immediate threat is definitely Russia. You know, China is becoming a threat, but that's a threat in the future at the moment. You know, they're more of a risk to other Asian countries at the moment than to NATO members. And Russia, you know, we've seen bioterrorism, we have seen hacking and misinformation campaigns that are not being dealt with by member states. And that's why NATO really does need to focus on its traditional threat of Russia. You know, they may be a waning power, but they're using whatever influence they can to continue to try and influence and weaken states domestically, to weaken them internationally.
Right, and then what about you, Stefan? Would you agree with your two colleagues?
Yes, absolutely. Even though China's economic power is slowly showcasing itself, I still believe Russia is the #1 geopolitical threat to NATO. If you look at the different cyber security issues in a number of elections in different European countries, such as France, or where they reported Germany, I do believe that Russia still poses a major security threat to destabilizing the economies, and it could be an issue in which all the NATO countries, which includes the European countries and the US, can unify towards a specific goal, which has been the major issue under the Trump administration.
Right, and then let's then consider, in light of the tremendous turbulence for the NATO relationship in the wake of the Trump presidency and possibly his re-election, of course, can one question whether the United States and the European NATO members still have shared interests and a shared worldview? What is your opinion on that, Robbie?
I think in theory, yes, they actually do, because both the US and NATO actually identified China as its main threat, but ultimately in very different ways. So the US really wants to compete with China. They want to maintain their role as a global economic superpower. Whereas NATO, on the other hand, they're focused more on the cyber threat. They focus more on the humanitarian crisis happening in China. And really, the only situation where NATO can combine, the only situation where NATO can compete against China is if they were to combine forces with the states, and that seems reliant on a Biden presidency. So I think, sure, you know, to some extent there is a similarity in worldview, but these different interests will lead to different ways in which they undertake that.
Right. Let's move on to you, Laura. What is your assessment of this?
I'd agree with an extent to Robbie there, but I'd also say we need to make a distinction between sort of US worldview and Trump worldview. You know, we've constantly seen the Senate working around Trump, as well as people who are involved in sort of the foreign affairs in the country trying to work around whatever he's saying, because what he says and does is on a whim and him being talked around and things. You know, America's views are very much aligned with Europe because they are still allied against Russia. They're now allied against China. And it's all about that collective security and working together. And as long as we are all democracies and we sort of have those same values, they'll continue to work together.
Right. And then what about you, Stefan? Do you share this assessment, or do you have an entirely different opinion?
I would say I honestly believe Trump is more so bluffing on that issue, even though he's been quite negative on NATO and has undermined the union with the European countries per se. I do believe that America will always look to have a sphere of influence within Europe. Let's not forget, if America chooses to be more isolationist from Europe, a lot of Europe's biggest countries are greatly dependent on Russian gas, and so naturally they will move towards the Russian sphere of influence based on just economic terms. So I do believe that what Trump says is just slightly hot air, and that America will do everything possible to maintain their sphere of influence within Europe.
Right. And then a final question for you. So again, in light of the uncertainty of the Trump presidency with regard to NATO, do you think that NATO should develop more strategic autonomy along the lines of what is proposed by the French President Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. What do you have to say about that, Stefan?
On that issue, that is quite difficult, because especially coming from France, who actually previously left NATO and wanted a more kind of multilateral union with NATO. In my opinion, no. I would struggle to see how a European a European Union with NATO could be as effective without the United States. The United States has the strongest military in the world, and I think that would be by far the most effective way to deter other aspects of whether it's Russian interference within elections, or if let's say the biggest issue right now, which is the Ukrainian crisis.
So yeah, it's unfortunately I'll have to cut you off. It's a very fascinating discussion, but now I'll hand over to Emily, who will introduce Sonia Lucarelli.
Hi there. Thanks so much to Professor John Denny. And our student debaters. We absolutely loved having you all on. Donald Trump has changed a lot about how the United States has been perceived abroad throughout his term. President Trump has made America more isolationist, pushing forward his America First policy under the umbrella of his Make America Great Again policy, with mixed reactions both domestically and internationally. On the world stage, Trump has earned himself ridicule from other foreign powers due to his pushing of this policy, but more so now with his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. A University of Birmingham recent graduate, Marketa Rehakova, seeks to explore how Donald Trump's leadership has affected global cooperation as a whole with Professor Sonia Lucarelli, a professor from the University of Bologna who specializes in leadership and European defense. They discuss how the events of Donald Trump's presidency have changed the perception of the office of the president, as well as the country as a whole. We now go to the video with Sonia Lucarelli.
The coronavirus crisis is specific in many ways. Unlike in 2008 economic crisis, the United States has not coordinated global help with its international partners. It has avoided even cooperation with WHO. Is this the result of Donald Trump's presidency? And how has he changed the perception of the United States on a global stage?
Well, I would say that Donald Trump is widely responsible for having damaged the perception of the United States, which does not imply that the United States was universally loved before Donald Trump. I mean, 9/11 is the most striking example of this. But the opinion polls that we have for the general public and the analysis of the press in other countries testify that there has been a deterioration of the perception of the United States and its role in the world under the administration of Donald Trump, for his personality, for the erratic policy that he makes, one day one position, the other day another, type of communication, the several steps into the dismantlement of the multilateral order, the disrespect of other governments and positions, not to talk about disrespect of women and minorities or specific groups. It seems to be more respectful of certain non-democratic countries more than the democratic European allies. So all this, of course, has conveyed a bad image of the United States in the world that has further damaged an image that in some countries was already deteriorated before.
And if Biden wins the election, will the US take back its position at the global stage?
Now, if Biden wins the elections, there will be some changes and some continuities in terms of foreign policy, and there will be some issues in domestic policy that have made Donald Trump possible, so that led to the election of Donald Trump, that need desperately to be handled in order to cope with what the United States is today. Because part of the reason why the United States is not that appreciated today is not only for its foreign policy, but it's also for its domestic policy. The interracial conflicts, the discriminatory justice, and we have evidence of all of this, rising inequalities, all issues that are tell the story of a very divided society, dissatisfied society that has produced, in fact, Donald Trump. In terms of foreign policy, I would expect, or at least we can expect on the basis of what Biden has declared, that he will change style with respect to the allies. And in a more substantive terms, he will also change approach. Biden is a pro-European. He's very much keen on transatlantic relations, probably even more than Obama was. He would, again, give more support to NATO and invest more into the transformation and adaptation of NATO, which is very much needed these days. He has declared that he will re-enter the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated by Obama and then from which Trump withdrew. He would again enter into the climate change, what can be called a regime, which is a very important issue. And probably also end the support of the Saudi war in Yemen, so also a different role there. But in other parts of the Middle East, like for instance, the support to Israel, the support to the agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, we cannot expect big changes.
And with that, we're going to hand over to Bola.
Hi, I'm Bola. The Trump presidency has a divided reputation in Africa and the Middle East. On one hand, a few successes, on the other, a few failures. Tonight, I hope to gain some information from my experts and my panel of debaters on the direction they think each candidate would take to strengthen America's relationship with Africa and the Middle East. First, I have a video interview with Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi on American foreign policy in the Middle East.
Now. So I am Bola Olagunju, and I'm going to be doing an interview now with Professor Abiodun Adeniyi on American foreign policy in Middle East and Africa. Professor Abiodun Adeniyi is the head of department at Bayes University of Mass Communications. He joined them as a senior lecturer. Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi got his bachelor's degree in sociology from Ahmadu Bello University, and then he got his master's after winning a Chevening scholarship in 2003 at Leeds University, where he also got his PhD. He has worked as a communication consultant for several national and international bodies. Welcome, Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much, sir. So I'll ask you questions first about the Middle East, and then I'll move on to Africa.
Okay.
The Abraham Accords were signed this year to much international support and celebration. Do you believe President Trump deserves credit for this, as he has claimed several times?
Well, I think America has been in a leadership position in international politics over years, and leadership position entails a whole lot of things. One, it's intervention in places where there are crises, and ultimately, which is the second, is to bring about peace, so that we can have a sustainable world economic and political order founded on some level of tranquility. And of course, we know that the Middle East region is a place that has been characterized with tension over the years, sometimes open conflagration, and sometimes maybe a crisis of confidence at the subtle level. Sometimes, of course, this evens up to
interruptions and disruptions of economic processes and procedures, a good relationship among nations around those places. And of course, anytime there is an opportunity for peace, and whoever fosters that peace and understanding deserves commendation. It doesn't matter what we know or how we appreciate Donald Trump, but the fact that he was able to pull that through is one more milestone in the process of reconstructing the region through the prism of peace, as the case could be.
Yes, definitely, definitely. So the Iran deal, considered a hallmark of the Obama-Biden administration in foreign policy, was taken apart by Donald Trump. There has also been an added escalation of tensions between America and Iran after the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. How do you think the Biden administration will handle the increased tensions if he wins the election?
Well, the foreign policy dispositions of administrations sometimes differ. Obama's own was essentially funded on diplomacy, and probably diplomacy without end, believing in the efficacy of deliberation, of consultation, in trying to bring about understanding. That was probably integral to the philosophy of the Democrats as a political party in the United States. And of course, when Donald Trump came in, expectations were high. And of course, he said it prior to his election that most of Obama's policies were going to be reversed. So the Iran deal was understandably, changed when he came in because he thought that that was slightly condescending. He cancelled it, and against the background of assertions that it was more like a blackmail, a nuclear blackmail, and of course, America under him or under the Republican, as the case could be, was not going to live under that construction, and that's why he went ahead and cancelled it. And he has taken some other drastic measures, including, around aggression anyway, leading to the killing of the general. Well, overall, there's still an uneasy calm between Iran and America in terms of their relationship, and we cannot say that all is well, as the case presently is. And that's why going forward, by the time if Biden wins, for instance, will expect some level of the return of diplomacy, conciliation, understanding rather than aggression.
Hi, and we're back for our debate on the Middle East. I have Avani, Daniel, and Stefan. So, first question. How do you think the Biden and the Trump administration differ when it comes to foreign policy in the Middle East? And first, I'll start with Avani.
Well, I think the main difference would be that Joe Biden would look to reincorporate Iran back into the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is also known as the Iran nuclear deal. But the trade-off for this could be that it might affect relationships with Saudi Arabia. I think that Joe Biden would move away from a more checkbook diplomatic style, which Donald Trump has amassed over the last 4 years, especially with Saudi Arabia and now potentially looking at the UAE as well. And I think he'd be more stringent in cracking down on the human rights abuses which Saudi Arabia have committed. For example, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the war crimes committed in Yemen. And what this will do is it will keep USA in line with Western allies. In terms of foreign policy for Palestine, I think he'll look to reverse the funding cuts and foreign aid cuts which Donald Trump implemented in 2018. And I think he'll also be more proactive in fighting ISIS, as you've recently seen a resurgence in their mission for a global caliphate in the northern parts of Iraq and some parts of Syria. And I think that in terms of what Donald Trump was looking at for a more retrenched US foreign policy, I think that Joe Biden understands the problems of this and how security vacuums can result from these sort of policy decisions. And I think that understanding the ramifications of such policies, he will understand that this cannot be done.
Thank you, Vani. Daniel, same question.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that Trump has definitely had some success in the Middle East. The Abraham Accords, I think, is a milestone in Arab-Israeli relations, and I think that's going to continue. The same thing again with Trump's dealings with Iran. I think the justification for targeting Soleimani was definitely there. I mean, you can see that the Soleimani has actively tried to quell and distort and sabotage U.S. interests in Iraq. The Quds Force previously has also sabotaged U.S. interests in Lebanon. So I think Trump has had some success there. Where I think he is going wrong is on counterterrorism. I think that Trump has largely been focused on Iran and has less focused on ISIS. As proven in the last couple of months, ISIS attacks have already increased by 25%, yet Trump has indicated that he's not going to revisit the matter and has actually declared that ISIS has been defeated. And the same thing goes in Afghanistan. He's a key focal point for Trump's success in 2016 was he's going to withdraw troops from the Middle East. As we look at Afghanistan now, the Taliban has just in the last few days attacked the Lashkar region, and has also declared that it is not going to cut off ties with Al Qaeda. So I think Biden has also indicated that he's willing to look at terrorism, willing to look at ISIS and the threat that the Taliban pose to Afghanistan, and really focus that. I mean, the events in the last few days in Europe are evidence of the fact that terrorism is a real and present danger to the region and to the world. So I think that Biden is going to look more at counterterrorism, and I think Trump's going to look more at Iran still in the future.
Thank you. And Stefan, on to you.
Yeah, I personally think that they will differ in three main areas. So the first area obviously will be the Iran nuclear deal. Although I do think Biden is willing to start it up again, I don't believe Iran will be as willing to accept the actual same terms. But I do believe some form of detente will be applied. So for example, in the 90s, they would send sports teams, American sports teams, to go to Iran just to kind of cool down the actual tensions. The other major issue is also Saudi Arabia. Biden has publicly stated that he will stop arms sales for the involvement within the war in Yemen. So I do think that the relationship with Saudi Arabia won't be as warm as it was under the actual Trump administration. And the third main area, which is the Israeli-American relationship, Biden has publicly stated that he is against settlement expansion, and he's also much more for bilateral talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians, rather than just have the Israelis within the actual talks. And he also honored the Abraham Accords. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. So, guys, quickly, I'll start with Avani. Who do you think is better for the Middle East, Trump or Biden? Avani.
I would, without a doubt, say that Joe Biden is definitely better for the Middle East, because if you look at the outreach that he'll have for the Palestinians, I think that will be definitely a benefit to those. In terms of the possible security vacuums that Donald Trump could create by retrenching every single US troop from the region, it's very dangerous and it's very naive. So I think, but with Joe Biden's more foreign policy expertise and having served under the Obama administration, he'd understand these problems, and he will hopefully not add to them by deciding to retrench every single US serviceman from.
Thank you, Avani. Thank you, Avani. Daniel, who's better, Trump or Biden?
I would agree with Avani on here. I think that, although I think that the Arab-Israeli conflict is not going to, I think the US has always been pro-Israel, and it always will be. And I think there's going to be no difference and no different treatment towards the Palestinians in the future. I think that that Biden is definitely going to look more favourably on counter-terrorism. He's definitely going to look to try and counter ISIS and Al Qaeda and try and keep troops in Afghanistan for a longer period than Trump is saying. So I think Biden.
Stefan, quickly, Trump or Biden?
For me, I'm going to differ from my colleagues. I definitely think Trump will be better for the Middle East, because his main focus is on Iran, and for me that is the major exporter of terrorism around the world. And I think a hardline policy by Trump will definitely suit the interests of the Middle East more than Joe Biden's conciliatory approach to Iran.
Thank you, Stefan. And now on to my second video with Dr. Abiodun about foreign policy in Africa.
Sorry to interrupt, Ola, but it looks like we have some breaking news.
Thank you. The CNN are reporting that polls have just closed in several states. These are Georgia, the rest of Indiana and Kentucky, South Carolina, Vermont, and Virginia. The BBC has reported that Donald Trump is projected to win Indiana. The state, home to Vice President Mike Pence, generally votes Republican, although Barack Obama secured a narrow win in 2008. The state has 11 electoral college votes. Associated Press has reported that President Donald Trump has won Kentucky and Democrat Joe Biden has carried Vermont. Associated Press has also reported that millions of voters braved coronavirus concerns and occasional long lines Tuesday to choose between President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Those who turned out in person joined over 100 million fellow Americans who voted days or weeks earlier, a record number that has represented 73% of the total vote in the 2016 presidential election. Spirits were high and positive, and many polling places after a long, exceptionally divisive campaign. The BBC reported that turnout continues to smash records in the 2020 election. The early voting guru, Professor Michael McDonnell of the University of Florida, says that Oregon became the 5th US state to exceed the total number of votes cast in 2016. Texas, Hawaii, Montana, Washington, and now Oregon are seeing enormous voter enthusiasm. Texas is a competitive state with a somewhat competitive Senate race, and Montana has a closely watched Senate contest too. The CNN is reporting that the most important issue to voters in the 2020 election is the economy, with around 1/3 who chose it, followed by around 1 in 5 for racial inequality, and the same who chose coronavirus. Over half of voters say that it's more important to contain the coronavirus than rebuild the economy. The electoral splits on how well efforts to contain the coronavirus are going. Around half of voters who think containing the virus is going well, and the other half who says it's going badly. The CNN is also reporting that voters who back President Donald Trump are strongly voting for the candidate rather than against his opponent, with around 4 in 5 saying so, early exit poll shows. Some Biden voters are doing the same, but to a lesser extent. Around 2/3 of Biden voters say that they're voting for their candidate, while around 1/3 say that they are voting against Trump. The BBC has reported about the US election polls and which of the presidential candidates seems to be winning polls in the battleground states. These states have proven to be important in winning the election. Biden is seemingly winning Arizona, Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Wisconsin, whilst Trump is seemingly winning Georgia, Iowa, North Carolina, Ohio, and Texas. But it's the battleground states where Mr. Trump won big in 2016 that his campaign team will be the most worried about. His winning margin in Iowa, Ohio, and Texas was between 8 and 10% back then, but it's looking much closer in all 3 at the moment. That's one of the reasons why some political analysts rate his chances of re-election as low as things stand. 538, a political analysis website, says Mr. Biden is favored to win the election, while The Economist says he's very likely to beat Mr. Trump. But this year, there's even more uncertainty than normal due to the coronavirus pandemic and the effect it's having on both the economy and how people will vote. So all polls should be read with some skepticism. That's all for me now. We will have more later. Back to you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that breaking news. And now onto my video with Alberto and Denny about American foreign policy in Africa.
So I will now ask you questions about Africa. So I'll start now. So do you think American foreign policy in Africa under the Trump administration has been shaped by China's influence? And how do you think this has possibly affected the perception of American foreign policy in Africa?
Well, I do not see America as being essentially reactive to the foray of Chinese into a pattern that they have established over many years. Africa is largely vassal. Africa is largely emerging. Africa is largely underdeveloping, and because of that, they need the partnership, the support of prosperous nations, civilized industrial democracies like the United States, and that has been the practice over the years, and that practice is definitely impossible for it to be discontinued on account of the rise of China. China is still rising no matter how we put it, because they still have their own limitations, but in terms of economic prosperity, of course, they have been successful, and that success has led to the externalization of their resources in loans and grants, and aids to Africa. And it's something that American government, as far back as the period of Bill Clinton, has acknowledged too. And maybe in another 10, 15 years, China may be a world power, just like the United States is, just like us as well. And nations go and nations come. No empire lasts forever. But what remains, however, is the record that a certain empire has left behind. So the competition will remain, but also talking about this competition, we need to realize that tensions often exist in terms of influence amongst very strong nations. At the time, it was the United Union of Soviet Social Republic with the United States of America. Now, at some level, we have Russia, the United States, and of course, maybe China and US is an emerging one. But even if we say it's emerging, even if there are signs to it, there are levels, there are reasons for us to say that it is not full-fledged yet. Because America still has a consequential edge over China in terms of development, in terms of organization of government, in terms of riches, in terms of prosperity, and in terms of the ability to offer help to needing nations like nations in Africa. The competition might be snowballing, but it's not full-fledged yet. And I think Africa also needs to be very watchful so that at the end of the day, it will not just be a complete vassal, of nations that engage in diplomacy that are meant to trap them, and trap their future generation. And that's why we've been talking about the need for us to be creative and ingenious and generate our own wealth, for our leaders to be much more conscientious, selfless, and to avoid to not be self-aggrandizing, so that we can, be much more inward-looking and be less dependent on suspicious loans that will trap future generations and impoverish us forever.
That's really good. So, of recent, the Trump administration has been criticized for how they deal with migrants from Africa, and the different policies that they have brought into place in regards to African migrants. How do you feel the Biden administration will differ from the Trump administration?
Well, I think Trump came up with the philosophy of making America great again. And integral to that philosophy is the reasoning that America has been much more concerned about service to others, about concern for others, much more than America itself. And one area he focused on is trying to limit the influx of immigrants to the American society. The late 21st century, where we have a large pool of migrants going to the industrial west from across the world. And these industrial west are just about 20% of the global population. But the movement, of course, is informed or factored by their prosperity. And the pressure is much on them. And if they are starting to react, we cannot blame them, anyway.
Hello, and we have with us now Avani and Lloyd, our debaters on Africa. So the question is, do you think the Trump administration's foreign policy in Africa is geared to oppose China? And how do you think the Biden administration would differ? First, I'll start with Avani.
In short, yes. The little that Donald Trump has done in Africa has been used in order to combat China's Belt and Road Initiative. Trump sees foreign policy and views foreign policy through a very zero-sum lens, where he only believes there can be one beneficiary at the end of every agreement, deal, etc. And that could be one of the reasons for his little investment within Africa. For example, if we use the establishment, the established BYLD Act, the Build Act, the Better Utilisation of Investment Lending to Development, which formerly took over the former OPIC Act. The aim of this was to provide better corporate and private investment within Africa. Yet if you look at the nuances and the intricacies of this deal, you can see that it was clearly aimed to mitigate the influence of the Belt and Road Initiative. On the question of what the difference would be between a Biden administration, I believe that with Donald Trump's excessive cuts to NGOs and public health institutions within Africa, I believe that Joe Biden will reverse this. MSI America and The Lancet, two of the biggest public health journals within America, commenting on how this public health, the disparity in financing and foreign aid given to these institutions has led to an increase in problems in terms of medical problems, a decrease in contraceptives given and other social projects, which has all negatively impacted the health and well-being of Africans. I think that Joe Biden would look to increase investment and funding within these institutions. He'll use a more multilateral approach, and I think that he'll better use diplomats, advisors, etc., in order to build a better bilateral relationship with the continent of Africa.
Thank you, Avani. And Lloyd?
I'd argue that Trump has only ever really been involved in African foreign policy as a result of trying to push back some perceived Chinese influence and dominance there. But I'd also argue that that dominance has come because of his own disinterest during his presidency, and also his alienation of the region, his blocking of UN funding for the African Union, a really important political institution for the region, and also again cutting funding promises that were made before. So it's no surprise that China's filled that void. When we look to Biden, I think we see someone who has a very, very different vision for US and African relations. I think that he does actually value that there'll be an increasingly prominent geopolitical and economic bloc. I mean, by 2050, they'll have a quarter of the world's workforce. But he will be stalled by the fact that the preconditions that Trump's laid in the region, his disinterest and his allowance of China to sort of dominate the politics of the region, actually has meant that Biden talking about opening a window for US democracy can be seen as kind of a conflict with China. And so I think he'll be hampered in action and with trying to bring those closer economic and political ties with the US. And maybe the biggest legacy that he can have is cleaning up Trump's mess in the region. We have to look to the region, I think, as somewhere where there could be diplomatic flashpoints between the US and China. And I think it's somewhere where they're going to have to really look at quite intensely in the future.
Thank you, Avani. Thank you, Lloyd. And now I pass over to Emily on reshaping transatlantic relationships. Thank you.
The President of the United States is famous for labeling Europe as an opportunistic burden, taking advantage of America. On November 3rd, today, U.S. voters will decide if the time has come to make the seriously disputed transatlantic bond strong again. If ditches continue being dug, does Europe have a plan B? Marquetta will ask two former diplomats who used to hold positions influential enough to affect this very agenda before Trump's presidency, and the one who has just been appointed to lead the way towards future European defense and security policy. Much has been said on the undermined confidence in the validity of the transatlantic bond. During Trump's presidency, the debate in NATO shrank to burden sharing as the key topic. It undermined the unity of the alliance. On the other hand, it has also forced European states to increase defense spending, making NATO stronger militarily. We now hand over to this video of Marquetta and the debate panel.
Welcome to the University of Birmingham panel debate on reshaping NATO and transatlantic relations. My name is Markéta Řeháková, and I will accompany you through this debate. Let me firstly introduce our three speakers to you. With me tonight is Professor Julian Lindley French, very well known by his activities in the area of NATO's and European defense policies, which is evidenced by his 11 published books, as well as the fact that he held 3 professional chairs. My second speaker is Professor Jamie Shea. Resolutely fighting for the good name of the alliance, he became well known as NATO spokesman during the Kosovo War in 1999. More recently, he has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary General for emerging security challenges. And however, I do not intend to throw my journalistic impartiality into questions. I must express my enthusiasm about our third guest, because just like me, he was born in the Czech Republic, and recently he was elected Chief Executive of European Defence Agency. Mr. Jiří Šedivý, welcome to our debate. I would like to start by debating on the consequences of Decision 2020 for the future of transatlantic relations and European security. Each of you will get 1 question and 1 minute to answer. Professor Shea, how will Decision 2020 affect NATO's presence in Afghanistan and possibly its future presence in Middle East?
Good question. As I said a moment ago, there are similarities, at least in terms of foreign policy, between the Trump and Biden campaigns. Biden has long been an opponent of a significant US presence in Afghanistan. When he was vice president, he advised Obama to reduce those forces and rely instead on special forces. He has made it clear that he is not in favor of sending large numbers of US forces back on military interventions. President Trump has been the first US president that I can remember in well over a generation who hasn't actually opened a new military confrontation somewhere. And that very much corresponds to US public opinion, whether in the Republican or the Democratic camp. So they need to find some long-term way of stabilizing Afghanistan through aid, through cooperation, through military assistance and training, but without a significant presence on the ground.
And I have to stop you here. Thank you very much.
I finished. I think there's continuity there.
Thank you very much. Professor Lindley French, how will Decision 2020 affect the willingness of the alliance to start actively approaching China as a strategic challenge?
You will see references to China in the forthcoming NATO reflection group. I'm going to offer a vision. NATO Europe needs to develop a European future force that in an emergency, if the Americans are engaged in the Indo-Pacific, can deter and defend in and around Europe because the Americans are busy elsewhere. NATO is a worst case alliance in the sense that it has to deal with the worst of all cases. And I think the rise of China, with not in any way enmifying China, will finally force all of we Europeans to recognize that because of the pressure on the United States, we are going to have to make some very profound strategic choices indeed about our own defense, because the Chinese will force the Americans to make choices, and we must make life as easy on America as possible to maintain the cohesion of the alliance.
And my last question goes to Jiří Šedivý. Which options has the EU to ensure its security while not undermining American leadership in the collective defense and its presence in Europe?
Julian already mentioned that actually that US expects us to be more credible and stronger in the area of security and defense, exactly because of their interests elsewhere and us in need to be more capable to deal with the stability around Europe. And the European Defence Agency actually is instrumental in this area of capability development, and the ultimate goal is to have that the EU has a full spectrum of high-end capabilities. It's a long journey, 10-15 years, but indeed it should be seen always within that wider global geopolitical structure of power, and indeed the longer term trends. And in that respect, Again, we are not competing, we are complementing, and we are mutually reinforcing each other.
Does Europe need the US to continue to exercise leadership of the transatlantic relationship?
Well, I certainly agree that the Europeans still need the United States for their collective defense. I mean, studies, for example, by the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London show that it would cost the Europeans nearly 400 billion euros if they were able to substitute for the capabilities that the United States brings to Europe's defense. And obviously with COVID and the economic downturn, it's less likely than ever that we're going to see the Europeans be able to do that. In handling the major issues of our age, such as Russia, China, Iran, and the instabilities on the periphery of Europe, Europe still needs the United States.
That was a great interview with Marketa and three very qualified people. I definitely think Professor Shea had some interesting points on American involvement in the Middle East, which echoes Bola's interview earlier as well. For her next panel debate, Marketa will be looking at the main priority of NATO going forward. With such varied threats and country interests differing greatly between allies, have we created a trap with these conflicting and inconsistent interests? Back to the second video, continuing the panel.
Neither NATO nor the European Union has one clear enemy anymore. On the contrary, member states' interests differ. Poland and the Baltic states are wary of Russia's growing assertiveness. France is concerned about the events in Sahel region. America is under pressure due to Chinese growing global influence. Of course, NATO follows a 360-degree approach, but it cannot eliminate all these threats at the same time. I would ask all three gentlemen to present their views about the main priorities of NATO and European defense policies.
To me, the priority is, given the COVID-19 economic crunch which is coming, is how to balance the ends, ways and means of the alliance and indeed of European defense writ large. Yes, there are a range of threats, but in a sense they're across a spectrum, ranging from high-end geopolitical strategic competition from the likes of Russia and China, with huge implications for Europe, to terrorist groups across Middle East and North Africa, instability therein. How we generate the forces and resources, given the economic challenges we're going to face, strikes me to be the fundamental challenge of our security and defense age. And what I hope is that NATO in particular will move towards a new strategic concept, which starts to address that challenge, and indeed the EU strategic compass, which will be elucidated at the end of December, again starts to address what are the resources, what are the forces, what are the methods, what are the tools, the instruments that we will need to be competitive, effective and secure in a fast changing world in which there is.
Mr. Shidivi, how can we get out of the trap into which the inconsistency of interests has gotten us?
We have just finalized threat analysis for the first time, actually, a joint threat analysis, and based on that, we will have a look at our capabilities, at how to keep resilience, and I think resilience is one of the key words, resilience as the business continuity of our organizations, as the capacity to keep, to be relevant, as the capacity to maintain capabilities. And this also relates to the need to avoid what happened 10 years ago when there were absolutely uncoordinated, very brutal defense budget cuts. So I believe that these are the main elements, and we are now in a situation which is indeed overshadowed by COVID. But what is important is to keep always in mind is that the geopolitical competition has not stopped with COVID, that our contenders actually are abusing the situation, and we must realize this, and we must think as the West. I mean, the West, and it's NATO, one pillar, EU, second pillar.
I wonder who will be the most important security player for the European future and why.
We always need leadership. We need someone, who is coming with initiatives, who is setting tone. But at the same time, I mean, we should understand that all member states, big, small, are important in this respect. What I believe is really crucial is that we are now in the situation when we have several new instruments like permanent structured cooperation, like European Defence Fund, like strategic compass, and all this is going to meet in and to I believe synergize in the next 2 years. So it is extremely important now to keep in mind the fundamental challenges, to strive for certain strategic autonomy in terms of capacity to do more on our own in Europe. At the same time, to develop relevant capabilities to be able actually to act and indeed to keep political unity as much as possible.
Thank you very much. But there is still the pressure between the different positions of European states, because Germany has the leading role in the EU. France is really ambitious. The European Union tries to coordinate it as a whole, and there are still the United States. So how the position can switch in the future, according to Professor Shea?
It's a good question. My own view on this is that we need to sort of get two things right in the transatlantic relationship. First of all, we have to get NATO right, and Julian and Yuri have referred to this, which means to say that we obviously need a NATO which is able to do more things than during the Cold War, when it basically did conventional collective defense against the Soviet Union. If you look at NATO's threat landscape, we have Russia back as an adversary, but NATO is also looking at China, not as a threat, but as a strategic competitor. We have NATO looking at terrorism. We have NATO looking at new challenges like cyber and now space. NATO has to sort of figure out how broad its spectrum of interest will be. And secondly, it has to decide on which areas it's going to be a leading organization. Obviously, collective defense in the East, NATO is in the lead and other organizations support it. But there are other areas where another international organization, for example, the European Union, could be in the lead in dealing with an issue which is important for NATO. COVID-19 is another good example. NATO is not a health organization, but it can play a useful supporting role with its military capabilities to what others are doing. So we have to have a NATO which is more diverse, but which remains coherent. Now, the other aspect to this is that we can't be secure in the 21st century if we simply have NATO and don't have the broader EU United States relationship, which is necessary to sort out all of the other big issues which are going to define security in the 21st century. Who runs the digital sphere, for example, and the future of the internet and the notion of privacy of data? Who, for example, is going to define the new rules of the World Trade Organization? How are we going to deal with climate change and so on? And this is perhaps the area which, unfortunately, in the last 4 years under the Trump administration has suffered. NATO, I think, has done well, but that necessary broader transatlantic relationship on all of these other big issues has not seen the kind of coordination we need. And you've got to remember the Europeans and the Americans in terms of population, in terms of power, are going down as the others come up. And therefore the ability of the two sides of the Atlantic to work together behind a common set of norms and standards is going to be absolutely key. So that's where I hope that the next 4 years are going to be better than the last 4 years.
That was another great debate with Marketa and her panelists. I honestly couldn't agree more with Professor Lindsay French. As I said before, the interests and threats are varied, and I couldn't agree more that it's up to NATO how to for them to look at their priorities, and all of this will be determined by the NATO countries themselves and how they wish to deal with all of the varied interests. With Sidivi's point about COVID not stopping the geopolitical actions of countries, despite it being a worldwide tragedy, we turn to another potential tragedy, the potential collapse of NATO. In his book, Enduring Alliance, Timothy Andrew Saleh says NATO has been on the verge of collapse since its inception. While I don't necessarily agree with that, I can definitely see the points behind it, in that NATO was created as a security threat interest, and as things have shifted and grown, that has NATO itself has not necessarily changed with it. At first, its founding members could not agree on a unified approach towards the Soviet Union, according to Saleh, and after its collapse, the need for a military alliance disappeared. For the first time in history, however, NATO is threatened not only from the outside, but also from the inside. There is even a possibility of an armed conflict between two allies, Greece and Turkey, with recent conflict making the news, but stretching back well into their joining of NATO. With that, we go to Marquetta's panel for the last video.
The first question is for Professor Lindley French. What can NATO, as well as the EU, do to manage an increasingly assertive Turkey?
Thank you, Marketa. I think you're pessimistic with respect about NATO. I mean, all institutions prevent extreme state behavior. And NATO has been extremely successful not only in defending Europe, but moderating the behavior of some of its allies at times of stress. And Turkey's no different. Look at a map. Turkey's hugely important to the security of Europe. It's a pivotal state. But President Erdogan has certain particular views. I do think in dealing with President Erdogan, we have to separate the political from the strategic. Turkey has some legitimate rights to be a bit irritated right now, given the protracted debate over years about EU membership, for example. But when I speak to my Turkish friends and I put them a simple question, and I have friends who are close to the administration in Ankara, and I say, well, do you really want to choose between NATO and Russia? The answer comes back no. But we as Turks have to look after our own neighborhood because that's becoming increasingly fractious. So I do think we have to have a nuanced and sophisticated way of dealing with these issues. And I have to say the Secretary General with this technical group that's looking at the dispute between Greece and Turkey over in the Aegean Sea and other issues has demonstrated leadership. So once again, NATO has played a role not only in helping to secure the interests of its allies, its members, but has also mitigated, shall we say, fairly extreme behaviors of at least two of them. And in that sense, the alliance is a mechanism which continues to succeed.
But many fear that Turkey could at some point form an axis with Moscow, and this would be contrary to its membership in NATO. So there is President Macron who warned of NATO's brain death, and he had problems with Turkey in mind. So I would like to know if he was right to be concerned. Professor Sheikh, could you respond?
I think Julian made a lot of the right remarks. I mean, NATO's been going for over 70 years. No country has left. There have been tensions. NATO has had to deal with all kinds of issues over the years. Maybe the greatest challenge to NATO's existence didn't come from Turkey or any other ally apart from France in the years of General de Gaulle, and now France is back in NATO's integrated structure. So I think it's right for NATO to keep the family together. We are much better with all of the allies being in, even with some unruly behavior from time to time, than being on the outside. So I agree with Julian that NATO ultimately exerts a restraining influence on the behavior of its allies. It's been, for example, the mechanism that's been used in recent days to bring about a dialogue between Greece and Turkey and to defuse the military situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, you know, NATO is a club of democratic countries, even if sometimes we would like the quality of democracy always to improve. And therefore, you know, it's not the Warsaw Pact, so you don't have a dictator from a supreme commander that keeps everybody into a narrow conformity. And that's, I think, its strength, that it's open for these kind of political debates and political discussions. So I think sometimes this term crisis is a little bit overplayed. I mean, I was there, as you pointed out in your kind introduction, for 38 years, and I saw many times when NATO seemed to be in crisis until the moment arrived when it had to take a decision. And then everybody realized that putting NATO's solidarity in the collective interest, keeping NATO strong, was much more important than the narrow national interest which they defended up until then. So there's a kind of culture of the alliance to produce crisis and then to produce a resolution.
Such a positive opinion. Yeah, you are really optimistic.
Be mindful of the interest. I mean, Julian finally, it does have a good point in the sense that, Turkey for many years was pointing out to NATO that, it wasn't just about Russia. There were also threats coming from the south, which for a country like Turkey were existential. And Article 5, doesn't just apply to one country in one particular area. It can apply to a range of threats. And NATO obviously has to be, if you like, quicker off the mark in identifying those interests and trying to accommodate them.
Mr.
One quick sentence, Marketa. Yeah. Anyone who thinks that Ankara is about to forge a strategic partnership with Moscow should read a bit of history.
Do you have a specific event in mind?
No, just traditionally, Russia and Turkey have been competitors in their region, and right now they are in the war over in Nagorno-Karabakh. We are seeing again Russian and Turkish interests divided. Russian and Turkish interests in Syria are not as one. Russia and Turkish interests.
Yeah, but there are problems with the European Union as well, and with its European allies. There are problems with its European allies as well.
I would suggest that they are less structural than the frictions they have with Moscow over a range of fundamental issues.
Mr. Shedivi, what's the position of the EU member states in this conflict, probably we can call it?
First of all, EU member states are indeed behind the interests of its members, and there is a part of the problem in the Eastern Mediterranean, around Cyprus, etc. At the same time, indeed, we also understand very well that Turkey is it's a paradoxical ally in NATO and paradoxical country. It's as much as indispensable as it could be irritant. Yeah, but we must work with Turkey. Just imagine, for example, NATO without Turkey. Yeah, or Turkey being really in a complete odds with us. So. We need to have indeed a continuous and unified and strong and clear diplomacy, but at the same time we should try not to drive Turkey into any corner. Indeed, Ankara is not always helpful, and the very recent exchange between Presidents Erdogan and Macron is a case in point.
And with the end of another great panel, the University of Birmingham closes up its portion of the academic discussion tonight. I would like to take a moment to thank all the experts who have participated in tonight's discussion, as well as the amazing student debaters who have been with us all night as well. Without the help of Lloyd, Avani, Stefan, Laura, Robbie, and Dan, we would not have had such a great discussion. The University of Birmingham team, myself, Michelle, Adam, Bola, Frederick, and Marketa, thank you for tuning in with us tonight. And with that, we will send it back to Adam in the studio in Cardiff. Thank you guys so much.